to another edition of Life, Love, and Philosophy. This is the third in a series of programs I'm doing on heroism and what famous thinkers in philosophy, psychology, literature, and religion have said about it. Among the questions I'll be addressing in this program is, what kind of heroism might one see in one's immediate environment? For example, in one's workplace, family, neighborhood. But first, a brief review of the last segment I did in this series. Last week, I spoke about the fact that there are at least two kinds of courage: physical courage and moral courage. Examples of physical courage, I think, are rather obvious. The fireman, or fireperson, I should say, extinguishing a fire in a decrepit building, a dangerous building. The police officer pursuing dangerous criminals. The soldier fighting in battle. With regard to moral courage, it often involves standing up for an idea, often justice, an idea that one believes in, but that it's dangerous to express. For example, political dissidents, people such as Alexander Solzhenitsyn in the old Soviet Union, and Sakharov, also in the old Soviet Union, political dissidents who were punished by the authoritarian dictatorial government of the Soviet Union. Nelson Mandela in South Africa would be another fine example of a political dissident, and he was punished by having to spend 27 years in jail for fighting for justice for black people in South Africa. And of course, feminists in so many countries of the world would be in this category of people expressing in some way or another, or exercising in some way or another, moral courage. Whistleblowers also would be in this category. Corporate whistleblowers, such as the tobacco industry whistleblower Jeffrey Wigand, and the government whistleblower of many years ago, Frank Serpico, about whom a movie was made. And of course, among others who have been known to show great moral courage, have been civil rights activists in American history, for example. Perhaps the leading example would be the Reverend Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. Question: is moral courage rarer than physical courage? And another question: is it true that physical courage is often applauded and honored, and rightfully so, while moral courage is often punished? For example, people have actually been killed for attacking injustice. Among the examples, Jesus, Lincoln, Gandhi, Martin Luther King Jr., and many, many others. Socrates claimed that truth-tellers and those who attack injustice are generally disliked. Allow me to give you Socrates' own words. Do not be annoyed at my telling the truth. The fact is that no man in the world will come off safe who honestly opposes the many unjust and illegal doings in a society. And John Adams, the second president of the United States, put it this way: is it not strange and sad that simple integrity should have so many enemies? And Jesus talked about people being persecuted for doing good. In Matthew 5, Jesus said the following: blessed are those who are persecuted for righteousness' sake, for theirs is the kingdom of heaven. And of course, most of us are familiar with the proverb, no good deed goes unpunished. Dr. Albert Schweitzer, who knew a lot about doing good in this world, Dr. Schweitzer was a medical doctor who spent more than 30 years in equatorial Africa treating the poorest of the poor. In his autobiography, Dr. Schweitzer talked about some of the problems people often encounter in trying to do good in this world. Here are his own words. Anyone who proposes to do good must not expect people to roll stones out of his path, but must accept his lot calmly if they even roll a few more upon it. Why is this? And why are good people often hated, often punished for doing good? An outstanding example, I think, perhaps the best example in American history, certainly one of the best examples, would be that of Martin Luther King Jr. What was his goal? Dr. King's goal was justice. He was trying to promote justice in America. And what was his method? Dr. King's method primarily was that of nonviolent protests and demonstrations. And also, of course, sometimes going to court to use the court system to promote his agenda. And it is interesting that Dr. King, until the day he was assassinated, advocated only nonviolent methods, even though he was subjected to many death threats, and indeed his own home was firebombed while his wife and 2 little children were in it. Dr. King was hated by many. Indeed, the head of the FBI, J. Edgar Hoover, referred to Dr. King, and I'm quoting Hoover, as the most dangerous Negro in America. We now know that J. Edgar Hoover was an enemy of the civil rights movement. Interesting irony there. He was in charge of the FBI, but was an enemy of the civil rights movement. And today, there are both conservatives and liberals who believe that Mr. Hoover was a spiritually sick man. We know that Dr. King was assassinated after numerous death threats, which I pointed out before. How does one explain this? Is this a commentary on human nature? Well, part of the explanation consists of the fact that Dr. King was telling unpopular and uncomfortable truths. We're all familiar with the English proverb, "The truth hurts." Indeed, historian Will Durant put it this way: there are few things in the world more unpopular than truth, and the backbone of men and states is a concatenation of romance. Well, what painful truths did Martin Luther King Jr. tell? Well, first, he pointed out that our Declaration of Independence says that all men are created equal and that they are endowed with their Creator with certain natural rights, and among them is the right to liberty. Well, Dr. King pointed out that our nation had not lived up to this principle articulated in the Declaration of Independence. He pointed out that blacks were enslaved for more than 200 years in this country, and that when slavery ended, blacks were still second-class citizens for at least 100 more years, generally deprived of the right to vote, generally conditioned to feel inferior to white people by a legal system of racial segregation in the southern part of the United States. Not to mention the job discrimination that black people encountered, so often being the last to be hired, the first to be fired. What other painful truths did Dr. King tell, besides the fact that we had not lived up to the principles we had articulated, again, in the Declaration of Independence? Well, Dr. King pointed out that most Americans were Christians. Indeed, almost all Southerners were Christians, and that Jesus taught that we should love our neighbors. Indeed, Jesus taught that we should love our enemies. Jesus claimed that love is the highest law. Dr. King proceeded to point out that many Christians were not only violating certain fundamental principles on which this country was based, but they were also violating God's law in the way in which they were treating black people. Indeed, Dr. King pointed out that Sundays at 10 a.m. was the most segregated time in America. Blacks going to their own churches, whites going to their own churches, and whites not wanting black people going to church with them. Why were so many people angry at Dr. King, despite his insistence on using only nonviolence to pursue his agenda? Indeed, it was Dr. King's enemies who resorted to violence. Well, I think Freud provides part of the explanation. Freud claimed, we are all repressors and deniers. We generally don't like the truth, especially about ourselves. Psychiatrist Carl Jung also provides some illumination here. Jung said that we human mortals like to think we are more moral than we are. We like to think we are more moral than we are. And Mahatma Gandhi talked about how much hypocrisy there is in this world. Allow me to quote Gandhi, and this is a pretty powerful passage, by the way. Gandhi said this, "Every day I discover so much of hypocrisy in the world that many times I feel I cannot go on being here." And Mother Teresa addressed herself to Christian hypocrisy. And here are Mother Teresa's own words. "Often, we Christians constitute the greatest obstacle for those who try to get closer to Jesus Christ. We often preach a gospel we do not live. This is the principal reason many people in the world do not believe." And Jesus, of course, addressed himself to the issue of good people being hated. He said this, "Blessed are ye when men shall hate you and cast out your name as evil. Your reward is great in heaven." Is it possible that if there is a heaven, many people who were hated on earth are now in heaven? Jesus and many other intellectuals, psychologists, etc. in history have raised the question, is being liked by everyone a desirable goal? Again, is being liked by everyone a desirable goal? Confucius addressed himself to this. The great Chinese scholar was told by a disciple that there was a man in a nearby village whom everybody liked. And the disciple said to Confucius, "Master, what do you think about that?" Confucius said, "That's not sufficient." The disciple came back several days later and commented about another man in a nearby village who was disliked by everyone. And the disciple asked Confucius about this. He said, "Master, what do you think about that?" Confucius said, "That is not sufficient." The disciple, of course, was somewhat confused. And then Confucius provided the explanation. Confucius said the following, "It would be better if he were liked by good people and disliked by bad people." The Buddha also said that it's not unusual that wise people are hated by many people, although he went on to say that wise people are loved by good people. Emerson, the great American essayist, put it this way, and I'm quoting Emerson, "Give up once and for all the hope of approbation from people in the street if you are pursuing great ends." Nietzsche, the famous German philosopher, said that it's not unusual that people are hated for their goodness, And he put it this way. Nietzsche said, how often, let me rephrase that. Nietzsche said, have you ever met a person who said to you, you know, I hate that guy, or I hate that woman, and the reason I hate that guy or hate that woman is I know that person is much more moral than I am. Mark Twain put it this way. Twain said, nothing is so annoying as a good example. Question. Can one be a good Christian, Jew, Muslim, Hindu, and hate people for their goodness? The poet-artist William Blake provides illumination here. He said this, and I'm quoting Blake. The worship of God is honoring his gifts in other people and loving the greatest person best. Those who treat very good people badly hate God. Those who treat very good people badly hate God. Historian Thomas Carlyle put it this way. He said that honoring good people is the test of human nobility. The test of human nobility. Here are historian Thomas Carlyle's own words. There is no nobler feeling than that of admiration for one more moral than oneself. There are, of course, different kinds of heroes and heroines. One does not have to fight injustice or be a public person, a well-known person, to be a hero or heroine. We sometimes forget that there may be heroic people in our own immediate environment, as I indicated at the top of the program, in our workplace, family, neighborhood. Thoreau put it this way. The hero is commonly the simplest and obscurest of men, and I would add women. Again, Thoreau. The hero is commonly the simplest and obscurest of men and women. Emerson put it this way. There are persons who are not actors, speakers, there are persons who are not actors or speakers, but influences. Persons too great for fame and display. Influences. People who can be heroic by their influence on others. So-called ordinary people whose lives are an example to others. Here is Emerson again. Emerson on the essence of greatness. The essence of greatness is the perception that virtue is enough. The perception that virtue is enough. Among my heroes and heroines are the following. People gracefully enduring enormous adversity. For example, people with serious physical and/or mental disabilities. Honest, hard-working people struggling to make ends meet. Loving caregivers, people caring for the elderly who can no longer care for themselves. People caring in a very loving way for the physically and/or mentally impaired. People who don't go along to get along. People who are more interested in doing the right thing than getting the job promotion. For example, the police officer, teacher, military person, business person, who will offer constructive criticism of the organization of which they are a part, even if it means not getting the promotion. That takes courage. The poet Robert Bly talked about bureaucracies, and he said that so often Bureaucracies breed cowardice. Here are Bly's own words. He speaks of the cowardice that one learns in bureaucracy. What do you think? If we don't have the courage to speak out, can we still avoid being cowards? Yes, I think so. How? Well, we can at least respect and not torment the person who is attempting to make the organization more honest and efficient. Maybe even writing them an anonymous note or letter, congratulating them on their heroic efforts, again, to make an organization more efficient and perhaps less corrupt. Remember what historian Thomas Carlyle said: there is no nobler feeling than admiration for one more moral than oneself. And also, remember what the poet-artist William Blake said: the worship of God is honoring his gifts in other people and loving the greatest person best. Those who treat very good people badly hate God. Dante, the famous poet, in his masterpiece, The Divine Comedy, reserved a special place in hell for people who remain neutral in a moral crisis. In other words, he reserved a special place in hell for people who refuse to side with the good guys. For example, in discrimination against blacks, Jews, women, etc. If you believe in God and hell, what might be God's punishment for those who actively oppose people trying to make the world a more just place? For example, is it possible that Southern politicians and other citizens, ordinary citizens of the South and the North and other parts of the United States, who actively opposed Martin Luther King Jr.'s efforts to make our country a more moral place, is it possible, again, if you believe in God and hell, that those people are now burning in hell? Are the clergy doing enough to remind people that it is gravely sinful to oppose those fighting for justice, whether they are doing it in offices, schools, healthcare systems, the criminal justice system, and elsewhere? Indeed, indifference to those fighting for justice is evil. We can sin by doing nothing. There are sins of omission, when we sit by idly and do nothing in the face of injustice, in the face of other people being treated unjustly in this world. When was the last time you heard a sermon by a priest, minister, rabbi, or imam on this subject I am presently addressing? With regard to Catholics, I myself was raised a Roman Catholic. We Catholics go to confession, or at least church-going Catholics go to confession. I wonder how many Catholics confession has gone in the following way: bless me, Father, for I have sinned. I have actively opposed, or at least remained indifferent, to other people's efforts to make this world a more just place. Again, I wonder how many Catholics, in confessing to their priest, have confessed to the sin of opposing those who are trying to make this world a better place. I've been addressing the question, what kind of heroism might we see in our immediate environment? Remember, Thoreau said, the hero is commonly the simplest and obscurest of men. Well, I think another example of heroism we often see in our immediate environment concerns elderly people. Elderly people who have spent years doing their jobs diligently and who have tried to be fair in their dealings with other people. knowing, by the way, that this world is often unfair. It's often been said that life is made significant by the struggle. Indeed, life is made even more significant by struggling with dignity. After all, the hero, the heroine, is often a just person. It is often a person trying to be just, again, in a world in which there is much evil. And so often, these very just people know that some people consider people stupid or ignorant for trying to be good in a world in which there is much evil. Psychiatrist Viktor Frankl, a Jew who spent several years as an inmate in a concentration camp and whose wife and other members of his family were killed by the Nazis, claimed that our mission in life is to join the minority. Our mission in life is to join the minority. Psychiatrist Viktor Frankl put it this way, and I'm quoting him. It is true that the decent people in this world form a minority, and yet I see therein the challenge to join the minority. For the world is in a bad state, but everything will become far worse unless each of us does his best. He continues, let us be alert. Since Auschwitz, we know what people are capable of. Since Hiroshima, we know what is at stake. Again, he said this in a book I highly recommend, a book entitled Man's Search for Freedom. Again, a book by psychiatrist Viktor Frankl. As usual, I'd like to close with a comment from Henry David Thoreau. In his masterpiece, Walden, Thoreau penned the following words: "To affect the quality of the day, that is the highest of arts."